25 years ago, I served as a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. As part of that missionary service, I spent some time in the nation of Austria. When I arrived in Austria, the mission president told us that we were absolutely forbidden to preach the gospel to Nazis, and that we would know them when we met them. I can remember at least 3 times where I tracked into a former member of the National Socialist Party. I know this because they had in their possession books of certain titles and uniforms with certain markings on them that demarcated them as members of a certain enforcement wing of the National Socialist Party. And so for most of my life since then, I've had a serious problem with people who use the term Nazi without the proper qualifications. I don't believe that if you have never actually met a real Nazi, you get any right to call anyone that. Not that I claim the right to call them, I just don't think you have it either. And yet we have people going around using the term carte blanche and stripping it of any meaning, and also using it to achieve objectives. The first time I ever fought for this was when I was at university, when someone complained one day about the parking Nazis who were enforcing the rules for illegal parking in the parking lot. I knew one of these people, and he's not a particularly great person, but being a bad person does not make you a National Socialist. It just makes you a bad person, and not every bad person is a National Socialist. Some of them are other things, like fascists, totalitarians. Some of them are narcissists, sociopaths. But it doesn't make you a National Socialist. That is a political ideology. And it is interesting that the people in our country who are socialists or who are advocates of socialism will paint their opponents as if they were Nazis, as if we don't know what Nazi, National Socialist, stands for in the first place. It is interesting to see a pot call a kettle black. For members of the Democrat Party who advocate for socialist policies openly and clandestinely paint their opponents in this particular caricature. It is lazy, it is weak, and it is illegitimate. I also watched last month when I was in Europe as individuals tried to paint the Jews as genocidal. Having recently been to Auschwitz-Birkenau, that didn't sit very well with me. Fortunately for me, it didn't sit very well with the police in Prague either, who broke up the protest. I don't think that people who use these terms have any idea the damage that they are doing, and that the people at the top who are using these terms have no idea the width and breadth of the damage they are doing to the world in its entirety in their feeble efforts to accumulate a small scintilla of power. And yet the ad hominem seems to work. There are lots of people who are convinced that the opponents of the current administration are Nazis, even though they are not socialists, they are not German, and the people who are calling them Nazis are the Nazis, if anyone is. I'm not saying that the ruling party in America is Nazis, I'm just saying that they're the ones who share the most in common with the group they claim to decry. Remember, when you point your finger at someone else, if you do it normally, you are pointing more fingers back at yourself than you are pointing at the other person. And it behooves us to look at people who cast others in a bad light and consider why they are doing so. The actual Nazis were never afraid to be called Nazis. They were proud of it. They didn't mind being painted as they were. And yet now we have people who are painting others in a negative light, and people are believing it because, as Terry Goodkind wrote in one of his novels, Wizard's First Rule, people will believe a lie for one of 2 reasons. Either they are afraid that it might be true, or they are hoping that it is. I wish I could tell you that all of the Nazis, the actual Nazis, are dead. But I know that last year, at the end of last year, the Canadian Parliament invited a former guard who was an actual Nazi onto the floor of Parliament and applauded him. And then afterwards, people discovered that he was an actual Nazi. I don't think that people who are not Nazis would even take the risk of inviting someone into their midst who was one. I don't think they're the kind of people who would applaud them, and I do think they would be the kind of people who, if they discovered one had crept into their midst, would immediately denounce them for the villains and the miscreants that they are. And yet I've heard none of this from the Canadian Prime Minister or his Parliament. I did, however, hear this from leaders of the church when we would meet them, and I did my utmost best to vacate their presence as soon as the opportunity permitted itself, because that they are in a league of evil all their own. Make good decisions, discern wisely, for with what judgment you judge, ye shall be judged. And I wonder what the consequence is for those who mistakenly attribute the term Nazi to those to whom it does not rightly belong. Godspeed. May God protect this country and our world and its people, especially the innocents.